Welcome everyone to Encourage 2023 webinar series on diversity, equity, and inclusion, using inclusive and affirming language in higher education, part 2, a regional discussion. My co-facilitator for today is Meena, Ilyas, Senior Research Accountant, University of Delaware, Chair of Region 2's DEI Committee. Our panelists for today are Rashonda Harris, Assistant Vice President for Research Post-Award and Contractual Compliance, Penn State; Lamar Oglesby, Executive Director, Research Financial Services, Rutgers; David Scarbeary-Simmons, Director, Research Financial Services, University of Colorado, Boulder; and Sam Westcott, Research Administrator, University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. I want to thank the panelists and their willingness to provide their expertise from their respective regions and remind all attendees that this is a safe space provided by Encourage, meant to foster collegiality and further our collective education and inclusive topics in higher education. We encourage everyone to submit questions, comments via the Q&A box, remembering to remain respectful and lead with love as we encourage the cross-regional discussion, continuing the conversation from part 1. In that session, Attorney Mieko Faley, Director of Legal Services at the LGBTQ Center in Long Beach, California, provided her expertise to membership, sharing her knowledge on the LGBTQ communities, the barriers LGBTQ communities face, and a further education that will support inclusive and affirming language and the best practices, especially as they apply to policy implementation. Now I would like to ask our first poll question. Did you attend Using Inclusive and Affirming Language Higher Education Part 1 that was offered on September 14th? In that session, if you were not in attendance, Mieko mentioned that oppressed communities have had their right to self-identity taken away, and using respectful language is the first important step toward creating a safer space for marginalized individuals. So we wanted to gauge membership's current knowledge in regards to inclusive terminology. And I see that about 62% of people attended the first session. Thank you so much for attending. So we do hope that we can get more education and acknowledgement out to the 39 or so that are participating for the first time in part 2. My second poll question is, are you familiar with the various pronouns and their usages? Some of the pronouns we're familiar with and are usually used in he, she, him, he, him. There's they, he, she, they, them. I see that there's a lot of participants who have somewhat knowledge of the pronouns, and there's quite a few that do know and very little that do not. So that shows that a lot of us are educated on the pronoun usage. There are some other additional ones referred to as neo-pronouns, which include Z or Zer, which is XE, XIR, or ZE and ZIR. And while those are newer pronouns, they're used by some to refer themselves without the context of gender. Finally, I'd like to gauge the membership and ask my third poll question. Do you know what LGBTQI2S+ stands for? Well, many of us do know the acronyms in the beginning. There are a few towards the end that even I was educated on part 1 offered earlier last week. Again, we have primarily of our participants somewhat familiar, and about half and half on yes and no. So everyone is on the same page. It's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, and two-spirited. And I find two-spirited interesting because even as these acronyms were compiled, that two-spirit is more comprised for indigenous people, and their terms being of both the masculine and feminine spirits. I found it very interesting and on task that earlier today in my department meeting, not only were inclusive images utilized throughout the PowerPoint presentation, but there's always a portion of the meeting that is dedicated to equity, diversity and inclusion. This time, as some of you may know, the focus was on Hispanic Heritage Month, which runs from September 15th to October 15th. And our DEI officer educated us on cultural pioneers within the field and the differences between Hispanic versus Latino, Latinx, and Latinx. And in my experience so far, the University of Washington does a great job at inclusivity and education surrounding it. So Rashonda, I wanted to ask you first, does your institution team recognize or acknowledge inclusive languages, encourage pronoun usage, similar to what we have today on our labels? Do you encourage adding pronouns during meetings, or how, and in addition to, are there any diversity or training education offered or also revisited as societal and terminology changes within your institution?
Sure. Thank you, Brigidann, for your question. Absolutely, Penn State does encourage the use of inclusive language and the use of pronouns. Many people utilize their pronouns and they have them as their labels. With many of us working in a hybrid or fully remote environment, such as myself, pronouns are indeed important. And so people definitely use them in their signatures, on their Zoom and team labels, so that others are familiar with their preferred pronouns. In addition, there are opportunities for professional development and leadership training that is ongoing and very accessible. There's lots of training opportunities that are what I consider canned training that you can do at your leisure. But what I like about this training is that you have the opportunity to have a engagement with the training. So even though it's canned, there are questions that require you to interact and really show that you're actually paying attention to the questions that are being presented to you in the information, so that you have the best chance to retain it. So those are the opportunities that they have in terms of for professional development. Moreover, they also have lots of initiatives that not only involve the students, but faculty and staff as well. And these opportunities are offered at all levels in abundance, so that people can take them at their leisure. I think that having plentiful options reduces the occurrence to say, well, I don't have time. There's not, enough time for me to do it, and there are not enough available options. So that's where we stand.
Thank you, Rashonda. I was wondering, Sam, could you also answer the same question within your region?
Yeah, so I left Region 6 and moved to Region 4, which is in the Midwest, in the last year. And so I kind of came in with a fresh set of eyes into an institution that was very different than what I'd been at. And the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee is the second largest school within the University of Wisconsin system. And Madison is, like, everybody knows Madison, but the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee is actually also an R1 institution. It's also an urban campus. It's already just diverse by Milwaukee being an incredibly diverse city with all sorts of history and interesting challenges. But one of the things I see is not only are pronouns welcome, and it's expected and anticipated that you create safe space so that you allow yourself to be yourself. One of the first things I got to go to, I'm actually going to grab this because it just happens to be sitting right here, is I got to go to, they wrote a whole history on the diversity within the institution and published a book about it, and then made it available for all of us to come and hear about the history, hear about the book, take a copy of the book. And they did this partly as a way of honoring and reflecting where they have come from and where they've had challenges, but also as a commitment to the institution and everybody in the institution to go ahead and move forward. So I feel like there's a couple of things that they do really well without talking about it. They just are. One of the other things I noticed is I work on the campus one day a week, and on my floor, the bathrooms are gender neutral. So but it says on the outside what facilities are available within the bathroom. So rather than looking at the bathroom icon and seeing a skirt on a person, which I never wear skirts, technically I would think I would never go in that bathroom, or pants. I see instead there's urinals and toilets and it tells you what's available, making it really feasible for anyone to use any bathroom. And the expectations aren't that you're going to walk in and wonder if you're in the wrong restroom, that all the restrooms are welcoming. So I think there's things that they do very well. Part of it is a reflection of the organization, the community. Part of it is also a way to respond to the state of Wisconsin, which I'm sure we could talk about later.
Thank you, Sam. that leads us into some of the challenges, and actually you express the opportunities that are available within labeling or using different means for addressing situations. Meena, would you like to go into the next portion of the discussion?
Thank you, Brigidann. As we know, there's new laws, regulations, and policies that are rolled out yearly. The next question for our panelists is, are there any parameters in your home state or within your institution that make inclusive policies very difficult to implement? And are you using that opportunity to affect change? And Lamar, we can start with you.
Thank you, Meena, for your question. Not that I'm aware of. There aren't any. I'm in Pennsylvania, but I work in Rutgers, New Jersey. So no, there aren't any sort of state legislature that's keeping us from pursuing inclusivity at Rutgers, which is a state institution. But I think through my work and through some of my volunteerism, I do have the opportunity to work with individuals who work in regions and work in institutions of higher education that are within some of these states. And it is very difficult. I think most of those states are still figuring out where they can be inclusive and not sort of be an obstruction of the law that sort of governs their states or their institutions of higher education. But I don't have any examples right off. Yeah.
Thank you, Lamar. David, how about in your institution or state?
Yeah, so I work in Colorado, and sort of reading about the state's approach in terms of its views on equity, diversity, and inclusion. The state of Colorado actually has a really strong presence in the DEI space, such that a lot of our hiring processes and the way that we manage our staff and student experiences are really centered around established policy and some of the legislative priorities of folks within the state of Colorado. Now, we're obviously not perfect as an institution. I think each of us can attest to the fact that there are a lot of ways that we can improve as institutions in addressing these types of issues. I know for our students in particular, we have a significant number of resources available to students to guide their understanding about new identities that they're introduced to as part of the collegiate experience. Staff are also encouraged to participate in those types of trainings as well. In particular, we have a Center for Inclusion and Social Change that actually has created resources for students to navigate sort of that paradigm, and a number of ways that we as an institution can investigate particular claims of discrimination, including the misgendering of pronouns for our students. I haven't seen that same approach for our staff, but I would imagine that our HR department would take seriously any staff member who has concerns about being constantly misgendered. And we have an institutional equity office that explores those claims to come to hopefully a positive outcome for all parties involved. But again, just acknowledging, at least for CU Boulder, we've still got a long ways to go.
Thank you, David. And Rashonda, would you like to comment on what Penn State may be doing?
Well, I wouldn't say necessarily that Penn State, but the state of Pennsylvania. It's funny because I work fully remote, so I'm actually in the state of Georgia. So for me, the laws of Georgia would be more applicable. And I don't know of any offhand. I do know that there are some grumblings of different challenges that are arising as a result of inclusive language. For example, I do know that within our school system, there was a teacher who was recently, I don't want to use the right word, but she was reprimanded, that's the word I'm looking for reading a book to a elementary school class that they felt challenged some of the inclusive language. It gave pronouns or it gave options to children that they weren't really fond of, in the sense that the parents felt that those stories or should have come from them versus in school. So this teacher was being reprimanded and is actually in danger of losing her job for that. But as a state mandate, no. But within Georgia, in different counties and townships, there are different things that are arising.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. And Sam, could you share your thoughts on this?
I do, just because I do sit in the state of Wisconsin, and if anybody's been paying attention to the news at all within the last year, the state of Wisconsin is constantly brought up. And it's interesting because I watch the headlines, I read the newspapers over my lunch hour often, and the headlines have been flipping constantly because the Republicans who were in power and are not as strong in power are constantly trying to move the country, to move towards some of the more rigid areas of the country in Wisconsin. So for example, they tried to dismantle funding for the University of Wisconsin system by counting out all the way out to almost the decimal point, all the funding used on DEI, and they stripped that out of the budget. And the university system and the current governor were like, they had to take the budget hit, but they didn't aim it towards DEI. And just this morning, the same legislative leader is now saying that there will be no raises for anybody in the University of Wisconsin system until they strip out the DEI, because they want it, they count it as racially divisive. And the counter argument back from anybody is like, look, major corporations are doing this. This is done across this country. We know that this is healthy, that there's positive benefit to this. But it's interesting to see them kind of fight back and forth and back and forth. And one of the reasons that we chose to move here is we do have family, and this is a great place for us to live. But we are also early climate migrants, and we felt like that as a queer family, we can start to become active again and as an activist in ways that we weren't able to do on the West Coast as much, because we had made many gains. I mean, I fought, on the front lines of marriage equality for years, and I did it because of, I wanted to marry and give my children the same protections as other married people. I don't really need the state certification, but I wanted the benefits for my kids, and my kids are now grown, and I want to be able to get back out there on the front lines. And part of that is to being able to fight for others and to fight for the benefits of others, because that's the space that I need to sit in now personally.
Well, thank you. As David had mentioned, misgendering and new identity, I was wondering if you guys could, if everyone could just comment on, has your institution addressed using gender neutral language in official writing and communication? So
Yeah, I have a short response to that. Yes, so most of our communications teams within the finance and the research administration division, they work very closely with our office for diversity and culture. And that was sort of one of the first things that they addressed, was looking at many of the policies or SOPs or any sort of notifications and how they were written, and to remove sort of gender identifying language. So yes, we tackled that a few years ago, actually.
that's really good.
We took a similar approach working with our communications team. So trained some of our leaders on what that communication can look like. We actually, as a controller's office, we scrubbed our website as well to look for that gendering language and made it more gender neutral. I see it this really centered around when we talk about our PIs, it's almost always a default he pronoun. And so we wanted to make sure that we were using more inclusive language in those spaces. And I do know that for a lot of the SOPs that we write, our business processes and things like that, as the director of my unit, I encourage my line leaders to look at those policies through that same lens, to make sure that the reader of those documents isn't themselves, sort of not feeling connected to the document itself because we're misgendering in that language. But I think that's great, Lamar, that you're doing that in the finance space, because I think that's often a miss for financial folks. Is we're often not the best in the DEI space and looking at it through those particular lenses. So it's encouraging to see that it sounds like other institutions are kind of starting to layer that into their work.
Sam, have you seen anything in your official rating?
I actually made this an action item, so thank you. I'm developing a lot of the training programs because we need to have some training programs for the faculty, and I hadn't even thought about that in the context. So no, it is now an action item on my list. So
Awesome.
thank you.
Awesome. Rashonda, would you like to share?
Sure. So I want to first state that DEI is actually a way of lifestyle for me. So when I got to Penn State, I looked myself And when I was preparing for this session, I wanted to be able to be well versed in it. And I wanted to say I was quite pleased to learn that Penn State actually has a Center for Sexual and Gender Diversity, and it's under the Student Affairs account. And on that website, they actually have transgender and non-binary at Penn State. And under that tab, they actually have quite a few policies that talk about non-discrimination policy, preferred and chosen name and gender designation policy for students, faculty, staff, and alum. They also have Penn State legal name changes and information for all student, faculty, and staff. You're even able to do these updates on your Penn State ID cards. And then they also have different information that you may update your records and scrub them to reflect your preferred pronouns, which I thought was really, really ahead of where I expected them to be, quite honestly. You know, when we look at our institutions sometimes and we look at them geographically, they're located in the middle of Pennsylvania and central Pennsylvania, and it's not much for them to have to be forced to do this, but they are thinking forward in terms of their students, faculty, and staff, and I was quite pleased to learn that.
Thank you. That's great. The other thing along this line is, I guess this probably happened a few years ago, but I didn't know if there's still, you notice in your company, any designs, imaging that's not reflective of DEI, like diverse individuals. Like if you do see that, do you have a voice to send that to somebody that can make a difference?
So no, I'm not seeing that as much. But again, our communications teams they're like all over this. So anytime we're doing presentations, particularly if it's going into the student body or into faculty, we have a process to send the presentation over to the communications team, and they're looking for all of those things.
Right.
And it's worked right there. I think it keeps certain individuals who just may not be thinking about this sort of out of the hot seat. So it's been very helpful.
That's great as a bigger institution. I know I was talking in a different meeting with smaller, I do audit, so just a smaller entity, and that's all new to them. So it's good that everyone's still looking at that and making sure everybody's being represented.
Yeah.
Sam, did you have any thoughts on that in terms of what you've seen?
I haven't seen anything while at UWM, but I do know that I could raise the flag and it would be immediately addressed. In my prior institution, I worked at a very well-known research intensive on the West Coast, and they had a very hard time struggling with some of these changes. And they had to address some of it because there was some egregious history that they had to address. And it was challenging because that required, faculty committees and a lot of, there had to be a lot of feelings around it rather than just recognizing that we know that this is not right and we need to correct it and we need to, fix things. It's interesting to see because, we always talk about our institutions of culture, and our institutional culture has to be, it's reflected in how they do things and where they decide things. And, one of the exciting things for me working at this institution was joining an institution with this kind of institutional culture, that I love walking through the campus and just seeing the diversity, feeling it, being surrounded by so many different people and so many different thoughts and degrees and areas. It's absolutely refreshing because I've been in a research intensive, very research heavy scientific world for so long. So
thank you.
I want to chime in as well and say that the University of Washington does a really good job of being inclusive, not only with all their communications, but as I said earlier, throughout the PowerPoint from the various divisions, you see inclusive images as used instead of just stock photos. You do see varying abilities. You do see them addressing and acknowledging Indigenous people. This is one of the first institutions I personally have been a part of where the onboarding process spoke to the Indigenous people of the area and their contributions to even the building of the University of Washington and how they contributed. So I thought it was very important that they basically laid the groundwork from the beginning. When you're joining this institution, we acknowledge all peoples, even peoples that had not been acknowledged prior to. And they reiterate that often in meetings. And I actually have on my signature line about the indigenous people from University of Washington that I saw from a colleague. And I said, wow, that's perfect. So not only do I get to add my pronouns, I get to educate some people on the indigenous people for my institution.
Yeah.
I wanted to check with you, David, as well.
Thanks, Brigidann. I wanted to add that one sort of lesson I've learned in now working for a couple of universities is successful institutions that address these types of issues. It's not all in one office. It takes a coordinated approach across different offices. What harms an institution, at least from my perspective, is when we rely on a diversity office to do all the work around what these conversations look like, what we should be considering with signage, what all these new terms and policies mean. It really requires folks from your equity and compliance office, folks in sort of non-traditional DEI roles, to be part of the conversation and to move that forward for it to be successful. And I think that's for me, the sweet spot is when I see that we're not heavily reliant on one office to triage all those sorts of situations that arise intentionally and unintentionally throughout our day-to-day. So I would just say that's sort of like as a best practice. If you were going to go open your own university, you're going to want to make sure that all of those offices are really interfacing with each other in an intentional way, and that you have a strategy around what that conversation should look like.
Absolutely.
I think that's actually a good segue into the next section that I wanted to address. So thank you, David. If you were attended annual this year, the SCDI provided registrants with a postcard entitled Know Yourself with an embedded QR code, which led to an implicit association test that was created from Harvard's Office for Equity, Diversion, Inclusion, and Belonging. I think that kind of leads to this discussion about, yes, the overall organizational policies and understanding, but if you don't know yourself and maybe your unintended or unimplicit biases, how do you know to get past them? So one thing that was really cool about that test is that it provides the opportunity to measure beliefs that people may be unwilling or unable to report, as well as, especially interesting, is if the individuals have implicit attitude that they did not know about themselves. So I was wondering, Lamar, since you had a big part in creating this testing, does your faculty administration have opportunities to engage in team building that includes activities that help develop self-awareness or understanding of personal biases? And if so, do you revisit these activities over time for continued education as our society changes and we get more updated as far as terms and inclusivity?
Oh, absolutely. So I think that implicit bias test, I shared it with my team first, my immediate team that I work with is a group of maybe 50 individuals. And I think we all, after we took the test, there were smaller conversations on sort of what did you learn. I remember when I was introduced to it, it was from an individual who sort of works in and does a lot of civil work, does a lot of sort of social justice work, supporting African Americans, who may have a difficult time in the United States justice system. So that was his life's work. And when he took this test, it said that he had a bias towards people of color. He had an aversion, and he was blown away. He said, "No way, this test is broken. That can't be." So he took it again and got the same result. And then he began to understand how there's many forms of programming that can happen, throughout the course of our lives. So when I took the test, I was nervous that I would get that same result, to be completely honest. But I didn't. So, I shared it with my team. We all took it. We had conversations about it. But then it took us down a path of celebrating, acknowledging, observing all of the variation that existed within our office. So I've shared a story in the past about our belonging board. We have a big whiteboard in the center of our office. In the top left-hand corner, it says "I am," and in the bottom right-hand corner, it says "and I belong." And for the most part, people wrote their ethnicities in various ways that they identify. I think the VP of Research Administration at Rutgers University, my superior, he put proud gay Latino from the Bronx in that order. That's sort of how he does it. But in addition to that, I mean, we have such a diverse office. It's it's very easy to some degree I mean, there's so much to celebrate. And I do mean everything, and we celebrate it in its name. We celebrate Christmas, we celebrate Eid, we celebrate Diwali, I mean, all of it. And everybody feels that they can come to work, they can be themselves, and they can have their team celebrate them and their authenticity. So I do feel fortunate in that. But yeah, we have multiple instances where we can be as inclusive, honestly, as we want to be because of that.
Yeah, and celebrating different cultural backgrounds is really important, and not just focusing on the ones that maybe are on the Gregorian calendar.
Yeah.
And also following up with education. At my prior institute, when Juneteenth is now a national holiday, it's often that you go to a particular group of individuals that you think have the knowledge on said holiday. So instead of just doing that and inundating maybe a particular group to educate the masses, an email blast was put out. Here are some information and resources about the Tulsa massacre riots, and here's some information about why Juneteenth exists. And so that gave a larger platform, and you can educate people, and then people can come back with more formulated questions, just instead of what is this. I'm wondering how you feel about that, Rashonda, and what your institution is doing.
So, it's interesting because I have a unique vantage point, I feel like, right? Because again, I am in the South, but I'm working in the North. And when I worked in the South, we didn't celebrate Juneteenth, but up North we did, which was interesting because it kind of goes with the history of how, things have evolved within our country. But one of the things that I wanted to kind of bring up is, and to speak on something that Lamar was mentioning about how we see ourselves and how we identify and what we like to, how we want to recognize and celebrate things. I actually had a staff member who had taken an ancestry DNA test, who found that they were a particular ethnic group and was learning more about it. And with intentionality, they wanted to celebrate their newfound heritage. And so I think that's even more important, because sometimes we look at people superficially, and we assume we know what they are or what their preference is and different things about them. But I think the beauty of diversity is understanding just the Pandora box of what you don't know and what you might find that is so rich with history and pride, because that person was very, very excited to be able to share that information, to one, have a group to identify with, and then share that information, and to share it in a space that felt safe enough that they could do it. I thought was really, really, it spoke volumes about our environment and our culture within that university.
Lamar, did you have something that you would like to add to that?
Yes, it's based off something you said regarding the education piece, right? So even when we aren't celebrating, which we tend to like to celebrate, but as certain months, if it's Women's History Month or it's Pride Month, we still communicate and educate the team on sort of what it is and why it's important that we acknowledge it. And what I find is that if there's no also commitment to the education piece, you can implement these practices, but you could be leaving a lot of people behind because they may not understand why we're doing these things. And then what could also happen is at some point, there could be activities or behaviors that are happening that are not in line with your values and whatever your mission is. And I often see that, right? A few years ago, everybody was putting up, we support diversity, equity, and inclusion, or they started implementing some of these practices, but if you're not educating people on why that's important, you can still have behaviors within that group or within that team or within that organization that does not speak to what you put out as your mission statement or what your values are. So the education piece is probably even more important than anything else.
Right. David, how do you manage some of the self-awareness or understanding of personal biases within your team?
Yeah, I mean, I was listening to Lamar's response, and it really resonated with me, because I think there's been rich dialogue that has happened over the past couple of years. And, I think that's sort of the foundation, right? Is first having that conversation to develop that awareness, to understand what these issues look like, how they manifest, how they are just embedded into our day-to-day, our institutions at large. And so I know for our financial unit, so we actually have created a space for our staff to participate in those dialogues, but to move from dialogues around what these terms mean and how this is manifesting in our workplace practices to, all right, we have that ground knowledge. Let's develop an action plan that we commit to as a community of financial leaders and actually start addressing some of those systemic issues. You know, are we hiring the right people? Are we retaining folks? Are we pulling the right levers and doing the right things optically, and just, I would argue, from a moral standpoint, to make sure that we have a diverse employee base, in addition to making sure that our faculty and students are diverse. And that's been really exciting to see people evolve and move through that space of learning and celebrating those different identities to, okay, what is my role in making sure that we as an organization move forward and don't just stay talking about it? Again, you know, that's not a ding on our institution, because it does take time to get that sort of base knowledge shored up with folks. But as you know, as I've been here a couple of years now, I am starting to see, you know, some progress in, you know, like the example I provided earlier, making sure that our language on our websites is a bit more inclusive, that we're actually running it through sort of a communication and diversity lens before we put information out. That's one step. Are we leading discussions with a diverse slate of folks who want to lead those conversations, or are we imposing a diversity tax on folks who themselves feel marginalized in their day-to-day interactions? You know, whether that's folks who identify as LGBTQ+, or are men and women of color in our organization. You know, that looks different, but are we making sure that we're even looking at those types of spaces, that the facilitated conversations are not falling on those marginalized individuals? And I think that's an exciting space to be in, when your institution is willing to self-reflect and have that introspection around what that needs to look like, to really be as diverse as we possibly can.
Thank you, David. I want to remind participants that if they have questions, you can put it into the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen.
Brigidann, can I pop in here too on something? One of the things that I think is really important is that for those of us who have the ability and perhaps have the privilege and the protections where, like, we don't have to look for safe space, we must create this safe space. We have to make sure that we're not just doing performative justice, but that there's actual boots on the ground and real value to what we're doing. It's very easy to stick a lawn sign out, but it's a lot harder. And we're called upon to stand up when we hear the things, when we hear the words, when we look around a room and we don't see the others reflected back. We don't see it reflected back in the leaders. We don't see one of the struggles I had in coming out was because of my age. Nobody told me when I was a child that I could be queer, because it just wasn't. And the only lesbians I saw in high school were gym teachers and softball coaches, and I wasn't like them. I was in the theater crowd. So not seeing myself reflected kind of held me back for a little while, but I had all the other privilege that it opens up and creates a safe space. And fortunately, my family and my support unit, I haven't lost any friends, any jobs, anything for coming out. So I always come out very quickly to try to help create a safe space, but it's not just that. I mean, we have to do it in everything. It means that if you see something, you have to call it out. If you can help, you know, I've from even something in the supermarket, or when I was in a group in a training and somebody made a comment about Mexicans, and I was like, well, you can't label any one group of people, but I had to take a moment and swallow hard and put myself out there as a person who was going to try to correct it, and not want to shame that person to feeling that they can't be involved and participate, but also make sure that statements aren't just made. So it's a really hard balance, I think, for some of us to remember that we can feel this way, we can take the tests, we can, you know, like feel like we have to check our bias all the time, but we also sometimes have to make the point of saying, we're going to be more than just performative. We're actually going to be actionable in all of this.
I don't want to gloss over the fact that what you just did. You stopped, you took a deep breath, and you didn't put your personal biases into the conversation that you were having in front of you. And I think the more that we can just arm the people that we're talking to let them know that we're truly here to learn from each other instead of express our biases upon each other, that does help to create the safe space, which leads right into the topic that Meena's going to discuss next.
Thank you. When Sam was talking, I was like, yes, we're going into that next. So now, right now, we're going to talk about creating safe spaces. So safe spaces are something that a lot of companies nowadays are aspiring to create, but are they creating safe spaces? You know, like you said, you know, are you just putting a sign out there and saying, this is a safe space, or is everybody in the community actually building that safe space, saying, talk about it, let me know who you are. I want to know who you are so we can work together better. So I think we have a poll right now about everyone's experience with safe spaces.
Yes, it's such an important part to create safe spaces, and not only to create them, but to sustain them. So to Meena's point, don't just talk about it, right? Be about it and continue to be about it. Receive feedback, be open to feedback on what you can do to make people feel comfortable.
And I think the relationship within our workforce and within our department, within any team we're on, is going to be better if you know the other person and allow them to share with you things that they may not otherwise share. So I don't know, I think, okay, so our poll looks like, yes, people do have experience with safe spaces.
We do have a small percentage, around 30%, that do not. So I was wondering if you can
30. Okay.
Check with our panelists to see how they have created safe spaces within their institution if one didn't already exist.
Yeah, so one of the other things that I wanted to mention was Mieko spoke about stigmas and how negative attitudes and a hostile climate affect the culture within our institutions. Many companies have HR resources that provide an avenue for reporting. However, let's look beyond the HR limitations and empower our employees to create a culture of partnership and solidarity. So for the panelists, my question is, first, can you define what a safe space may look like to you? And then can you share an experience where you recognize a lack of inclusive practices and what measures were taken to create a safer environment?
I'll volunteer and jump in.
Thanks.
So for me, I think it's important that we understand that when you create a safe space, a safe space is up to the interpretation of a safe space is up to that individual. And all we can do is really try to create an environment where one feels comfortable, but not being so centered for our safety that we forget that it may not be the same for others. I think that's really important to mention. Next, I think that as a Black woman, I'm often in spaces where I am a double minority, right? I'm a woman and I'm Black. And there are lots of times where I'm often forgotten about that I'm in that room, right? And the conversation changes once they realize, oh, you're here. It's even more common in a virtual setting, right? And so what I have done is I've gotten better about speaking to people individually. And when I speak to people individually, I try to talk to those who can make the change, not the people who will be impacted by the change, but those who can make the change. And the reason why that's important is because if I talk to the people who are impacted by the change, they feel targeted and attacked. But if I talk to the person leading the group who can, roll out that change and say, this is what we're going to do, it comes from a different lens. And so I think that that's a practice that needs to be steered, right? It's not one that you just do out all of a sudden. It needs to take time, and it needs to be intentional with the understanding that it has to be delicate, because the last thing you want to do is, while trying to create a safe space, is to ostracize the person you were creating a safe space for.
Thanks for sharing that, Rashonda. I really appreciate just like hearing that perspective. I think for me, when I hear the word safe space, it's often a very subjective term that's used, because to your point, It is an individual experience. And so as a leader, I can only influence to a certain extent that idea of psychological and personal safety in those safe spaces. And so for me, that safety is really inherent in leaders that actively listen, that are really open to a true dialogue about the types of issues that those safe spaces require. Because hard conversations often happen in those safe spaces. And as a leader, you really have to be open to receiving information that might actually be super challenging to take in the moment, or even when you have some time to marinate on it. But even just demonstrating that you are actively engaged in that space is an element of safety that you insert into those environments to keep that conversation alive and to build those relationships that are so important. I think the second question, Meena, that you had was around like where we haven't seen that happen. I'll spare the institution's name, but I often see safe spaces not being created in spaces like in hiring conversations. And so, as someone who does a lot of hiring, is often a decision maker in those spaces, I have found when you name inequities that exist in the process itself, in the candidates that are selected, in the types of folks who are actually sitting on those committees, it sort of breaks that barrier for folks where they have these moments of aha, hopefully, that they may not be considering certain things. Oh gosh, I looked at this list and it's all women, or I looked at this list and we only have a list of white people. And I saw it time and time again. And so I had to name it. And that's often a tough conversation because, I do hold some privilege in the color of my skin, but I don't have privilege in my sexual orientation. So it was that interesting space where, I really developed an intentional practice of making sure that as a hiring manager, I am making sure that I am making objective decisions, that I'm creating very diverse committees, that I am not asking the same folks, so that whole idea of I'm not taxing the same types of identities that I need represented. And that philosophy really has developed over the course of my career. I didn't learn that overnight. That was a practice that I made a ton of mistakes. I learned from those mistakes. I asked a lot of questions, and then I just educated myself, and I continue to learn as I move through my profession. So that's just the example I can kind of think of off the top.
Thank you, David. I applaud you for that because, one of the biggest thing is we all don't know everything. You learn, you make mistakes, you learn, you correct it. So thank you. Sam, did you want to share your thoughts about anything about?
Oh no, I think I kicked it off well, and I think this is going well. I think we had a question from the audience. Did you want to ask that?
Okay. So the question is, as an ally, how do you spearhead safe spaces for coworkers who are not experiencing it in their workplace? Or how can you advocate for an inclusive spaces, and what should it look like?
Well, I could take it on as an ally. I'm going to take it on like professionally, just because this is a recent example at the annual meeting. I was approached by an Incura leader because somebody had been misgendered and was not feeling safe and welcome at the annual meeting, and was asked like where are the queer folks? Where do I find my allies? And person asked me if I could reach out and connect. And if you all don't know this, you can reach out and connect with me on any reason, for any reason whatsoever, because I'm just that person. I'm always the extrovert. And so we did connect. And fortunately, like, it even opened up and connected me to other queer people within Incura that I didn't already know, and I thought I knew everybody. So it was really nice, but that it was just also like that ability for somebody to know that they could ask me, and that I would make sure that it got done, and I would make sure that person was involved. And part of that is just also always looking for an opportunity to bring others in. So it's one of the things that I've been very fortunate with, is people have offered me a lot of opportunities. I know part of that is my privilege, and part of that is my personality, but I don't ever expect to always be the one to take that space. If somebody brings to me an opportunity, I will always try to look for somebody else to be able to either come along or to take a space that I've already had the opportunity to do, or somebody who would be a better fit for that. And a lot of it is just, like David talked about being conscientious about it. Lamar talked about it, like thinking about it, being deliberative in your process. And that's how you can make a safe space, but you also have to pay attention and be open to it. You may not always know where there isn't safe space, but if you're a person that can create safe space or can create a safe environment, it's not just enough that you make it safe for the person to come to work, it's to make it available for a person to thrive professionally, that they don't just get to feel like they get to come in and push their buttons and go home, but they get to come in and look for where they want to grow and move forward. And that, to me, that's the most rewarding, and it's our biggest responsibility to each other as professionals. And it certainly is the biggest responsibility to me as a person of privilege, because I am a cisgendered white woman who appears heteronormative, that I get to move into that space. And I actually have the white male privilege as well, because of my physical size and my assertiveness, and frankly, not being raised with shame. I had a mother who was very proactive at raising me without shame. And so I don't have that normal feminine shutdown of I don't belong in this space. So if we all recognize what we bring to the table and how we can bring others to the table, regardless of whether it's a colleague or somebody that you recognize as like yourself, or if it's somebody who isn't at the table, that's what's most important to me.
Thank you. Kudos to your mom. So Lamar, did you have any comments, or I thought you...
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit, because I think everybody touched on it so well. I don't want to mess it up, but I don't know if it's possible, but I may have been introduced to the same individual that Samantha was talking about. And what's interesting, right, as we're talking about safe spaces, right, and I think about what has to exist in a safe space, and I'm thinking forgiveness, compassion, right, listening, right, intentionally trying to understand. When this individual expressed that they didn't feel welcome, they demonstrated that level of compassion. I had a conversation with them, and what they said was, it's okay. These things happen. If you need any help with training or helping people understand the importance of pronouns, please reach out, give me a call. And I just felt that was amazing. They could have been very upset. They could have decided to leave the conference and say, I'm never going back. But they didn't. They offered their services. And that sort of thing has to happen. And I love to see it happen right in front of me. And Samantha, you stole my thunder. I was looking forward to sharing that story.
But I think that's important to highlight, because someone did make the comment that a coworker mocked the idea of safe spaces, and unfortunately coincided with one of the mass shootings that happened at the Pulse nightclub, and no one challenged the conversation or supported. So to Sam's point, if you know someone that's more extroverted that can speak up on behalf of someone, you make these people your allies, because everybody's comfortability levels are different, and what they're willing to stand up for, to speak for, are different. And you have to know the different methods as well. Are there whistleblowing lines that you can speak with? Are there colleagues that have created that safe space that you can go to? You should know now, if you don't, that anyone on this panel is a safe space person that you could potentially reach out to figure out how to set up a safe space in your environment if it doesn't exist, or be that person, because sometimes it just takes a person. What's the physical setup and environment? Do higher executives have their doors open or closed? Do they walk around and engage themselves with people? Is the leadership team diverse? Is the executive board diverse? Like, all of it is kind of, is it reflective, or is it just being talked about? But being listened, and I hear the ongoing theme of education, re-education, continued education, which is what we're doing with this discussion today.
And then there's another comment in our comment box. Is the panel familiar with the idea of a brave space rather than a safe space? And if so, I'd like to hear the perspective on the choice to promote, characterize safe spaces in addition to instead of brave spaces. Is anybody familiar with the brave spaces?
Yeah, I'm familiar with the concept. I mean, the concept of a brave space is a place where people are actively encouraged to voice and share their own perspectives, which is actually outside of what they're generally comfortable with no one challenging that. So it can feel at times, it can land heavily on the participants in that type of space if they're not prepared to not necessarily be able to respond. I think it's an interesting, and it's poor abuse of words, but it's a branding choice for me. I think I like to kind of go between the safe space and the brave space, because it does take bravery to even enter a safe space where some of those same expectations around you're going to hear things in this space that it's okay to feel uncomfortable, and you by naming that, a lot of folks, that gives them a level of comfort and peace that, all right, I'm open to that learning. I'm probably going to hear something that I may disagree with, but exposure for exposure's sake, I always say, is a valuable experience. And even as someone who has sort of intersectional identities that don't often make me feel safe, I try to open myself up to perspectives that could be counter to what I have experienced. It's not if it's right or wrong. It's just not an experience that I have seen myself and really just aware of.
If I could contribute to the conversation, because I've actually experienced both. And for me, the difference between like a safe space is that safe spaces prioritize your emotional and psychological safety above all else, right? And so it's really designed for individuals where they can express themselves without, fear of judgment and harm or discrimination. And really the goal of a safe space is to create that protective, comfortable environment. And it's often done by setting a clear ground rule that to respect and avoid triggers, right? And any offensive content that, might be offensive, as I said. And it's really safe spaces are actually commonly more used for marginalized or vulnerable groups so that they can, discuss their experiences and find support, or even spawn off affinity groups. So that's, the difference. And the emphasis of a safe space is really providing a space for people to heal and share their experiences. Now, a brave space, it takes a slightly different approach, and where they acknowledge difficult conversations and disagreements and discomfort that may arise, but encourage participants to engage in these conversations openly and respectfully, because you gain an understanding by dialoguing with each other. In that space, people are encouraged to, address their own biases and confront uncomfortable truths and engage in constructive dialogue, which is really important. And the goal of those safe spaces are really to foster learning and understanding through the dialogue that involves disagreements or conflicting viewpoints, because many people don't have exposure to certain things, and they're now getting that exposure and want to be able to ask questions without any harm, because their intent is to learn, not to offend. And so the brave space is often used in an educational setting, and I've seen it used in diversity and equity and inclusion trainings to help people, kind of set a tone, but also welcome them to the conversation.
Thank you. So brave spaces also would possibly give that one comment that we had earlier, if somebody was feeling uncomfortable with somebody's comment in the workplace, and that's making that job so fearful for you, that would be a good venue to bring that up and hopefully talk about it. Thank you. I think we had another question, Brigidann.
Yeah, we're wondering if the panelists can describe how you mitigate situations that arise due to a lack of psychological or physical safety. And do you have an experience with that? Sam, do you have an experience with that you could share?
I do, mostly in the situation of the environment around academia can be very toxic in many, many, many ways. And so that toxicity can leak out based on biases that are like that look like they're more hidden, because we look like we're all like everybody's welcome at the table, but there are definitely layers in the caste system, as it were, in much of academia. And since I've spent most of my career at the departmental research administrator level, working like like elbow to elbow with faculty, there's a there can there can be an easy way for somebody on higher in that caste system to really belittle somebody, and then when they add into it something based on gender, when they when they layer it with misogyny, when they layer it with homophobia, when they layer it with racism, it's like it just makes that toxicity so much more poisonous. And it's very hard because it's, as much as we'd like to involve HR, I'm in my experience, HR has been milk toast at best in handling these situations, and it generally needs to requires some calling out and standing up and speaking out to power. And sometimes it really, in my situation, it has been where I have had to go and fight the structure so that people are not directly reporting to those people at the caste system who are protected either by tenure or by genius or by reputation or by how much money they bring in, and really removing them from the direct supervisory situation, but really getting them into a place where they can work, and their work is being judged by the quality of the actual work and not by the emotional flavor of the higher level person. And I don't know, because I've worked 30 years in academia, I don't know on the corporate side where we were gonna how this works, but I have time and time again had to advocate for individuals to be able to move them out from underneath space where they were treated very, very poorly because of the structure. And sometimes it's just, I'm okay saying very uncomfortable truths to power. One of the other things that I come with is both of my parents were PhDs. I was born to 2 graduate students. So it's like I was made for this job, pathetic as that is. And so I move through space feeling very comfortable speaking to people who have much higher education than I do, because it holds no magical power to me. And so it's not always easy for someone, but you definitely need to do that, because we have to not just create safe space, but create opportunities for people to, like I've said before, you have to thrive professionally. Otherwise, people are just going to leave.
I think that's a great segue into the best practices and case studies. Thank you, Sam. While often cultural competency is discussed, Mieko brought up and was excited to expound upon the concept of cultural humility and recommended a 30-minute documentary on YouTube by San Francisco State professor Vivian Chavez. Again, that's Vivian Chavez on cultural humility on YouTube if you'd like to check out the video. One comment that stood out to me in the film, which has been reiterated throughout our panelists, is someone said, sometimes we don't know because no one has told us. It's not a stupidity issue, but a lack of knowledge, which doesn't take away from your intelligence. So this allowed the individual to be more open and receptive about inclusivity without associating negative feelings or feeling of lack in regards to their own knowledge or intelligence. Because I think sometimes I know I could be held back because you think you might be a threat to what you know. To this point, sometimes you just don't know, and that is the reason we ask questions. And I might say it often, but Sesame Street taught me that questions are a really good way to find things out. And it's very simple, and we have to always revisit it. But if we can keep that in our head with Sam's point of taking a deep breath and listening and being open, so we can all incorporate more inclusive practices in our respective fields by gaining continued and updated knowledge, including policy to back up actions. And that's the way we can strengthen more of the culture of inclusivity overall. The 3 tenets of cultural humility are lifelong learning and critical self-reflection, the ability and hopefully to mitigate power imbalances, as we spoke to diversity on executive boards, on leadership decision-making, on teams that have the ability to affect policy and change, and then institutional accountability. So Lamar, does your institution show accountability and model any or all of these tenets? And if so, which ways? And do they have policies that back up the inclusive practices?
Thank you. I'm thinking a bit. So I do want to say the continuous learning, that the commitment to continuous learning tenet is definitely achieved. And I think they do a really good job at that through their leadership, particularly. Considering that those are the ones generally making the decisions, it's really important to ensure that the leadership within that university are getting informed around diversity, equity, inclusion, and that it's an ongoing thing. So literally just today, we closed up the financial transformation. So all the leaders within the finance division, central administration at Rutgers, each well, it was bi-monthly and then it switched to quarterly. We had diversity, equity, inclusion sort of 3-hour training / retreats to ensure that we were getting informed, and then had plenty of time for discussion, and then had some homework over the next month or two on how we were going to implement those things in our offices. So yes, I think we checked that box. What was the other part of the question, Brigidann? I'm sorry.
Mitigating power imbalances. Do you see diversity among your executive team, boards, or just high decision makers?
Yes. So yes, and we didn't just 2 or 3 years ago. But I think once you become aware and then you begin to change policies, practices so that they are more inclusive, you're naturally going to see change. And yes, we have. So our leadership board has completely changed. It is now much more inclusive of women and of people of color, where it was not at all just a few short years ago.
David, could you speak to the same question? How does your institution show accountability or model its tenants?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of sort of what spaces that that self-reflection actually takes place. I see that oftentimes at the leadership level in strategic spaces where a decision was made, we've lived through the decision, and we do a reflection on how that decision operationalized, who it impacted, what we misses in that process, and does it still make sense? So I do see a lot of retrospection at key markers, whether your institution has a 3 or 5 year strategic plan, there's going to be baked into that process. Hopefully there is a level of self-reflection around that sort of inclusive philosophy and what that should look like. I think we're starting to see some diversity at some of our leadership levels. I think one of the challenges institutions like CU Boulder, where they exist in spaces where diversity itself in the community that surrounds it really does not, the tapestry of that community is not diverse, and you try to impose that philosophy, as well you should, on the institution. There's challenges inherent in that, so if you are in an area where traditionally it's not a lot of African Americans, and you want to hire and retain staff and bring in more students, the optics of that from, I can imagine, the perspective of someone who is one of those identities that's not represented in the broader community. So if you move to a conservative area and you're looking for other LGBTQ folks, traditionally not conservative in the sort of politically leaning sense, you're probably not going to have a lot of gay leadership. And so I see a push to be more diverse with the constraints of just the community wrapped around us, that is causing it to take a little bit longer for that actually to manifest at our institution. And that is a challenge across the country. I mean, across the globe, right? Is what have we done systemically to create those spaces where some of those identities don't exist, don't feel welcome, aren't part of our inclusive perspective, that may be causing those folks to not consider us as an employer of choice or a place to pursue an education. So I'll get off my soapbox.
Oh, we appreciate that, because you also added points to where things are lacking and how one can incorporate it. Did you want to add to that, Meena?
Oh, no, I was just saying that was great segue into our final question. So on a final note regarding this, Mieko stated at the end of her presentation, small changes can make a big difference. So consider a scenario where someone is in discomfort in your workplace. A small step in the scenario would be making it your responsibility and the responsibility of your work community help end that discomfort. So change does not have to come from huge institutional mandates, but start with a small thing each of us could do. We are all human, and recognizing all people's humanity brings us to a place where change is the only option. So for the panelists, I would like to ask you to please share an experience or story where you played a role in supporting inclusive practices or recognize someone's humanity in your workplace. Sometimes I tend to add an accent where there shouldn't be, but.
Sam, would you like to start with this question?
Well, I shared an example earlier, and I don't want to be like, oh, well, like I always do things well, because I fail regularly at this. I find my own biases regularly. I will openly admit that I have one of the biases I struggle with and have struggled with for most of my adult life is I'm biased against the South because I was also raised not only by a feminist mother, but a mother who told me you can't live in these 13 states because they don't have equal protections for women, and they don't allow women to own property. And I had this, and so it kind of fed into that narrative. And then every time I go to the South, I'm like, oh my God, the food is amazing, the people are amazing, and it's so you have to sometimes, for me, I think that you have to look inside, and it's an uncomfortable place to sit. It's, I understand why people want the way it always was, because it maybe felt comfortable because they didn't see, because we didn't see people of color reflected back on us in media and in advertising and television, because we didn't see queer people in commercials. They're like the things that we are uncomfortable with are the things that we don't understand or don't know. And when I recognized, I remember working in Los Angeles, in Hollywood for a hospital, and I realized standing on that street corner when I could not hear a language that I understood, and that I felt actually really great sitting in a space where I was completely uncomfortable, because for once I felt like must be some of what people feel all the time. And then recognizing that and being like, okay, but I can move through this space and I can make space for other people. So I think that rather than, put another time when I did things right, I'm going to admit that I do things wrong all the time. I misgender people all the time. And I'm part of the queer community, and I've been actively involved with the queer community. And I still trip over my tongue because my brain doesn't get ahead of my mouth. So it's important to recognize that you're failing, but also to keep trying and look for those opportunities. I mean, I now actively reach out to people and say, I know that it's what you're working in. I don't need to lead anything. How can I help? And sometimes it's I cut a check. Sometimes I will send email. Sometimes I'll be a sounding board. I'll whatever needs to be done, because I now feel like I could be part of the problem, but in order for me to be part of the solution, I need to look to others and say, direct me. Where do you need me to be? And what do you need from me?
Thank you. Rashonda, could you please share an experience or a story?
Sure. So, it's funny that Sam led with her bias of the South. And I can tell you, being a person who was born and raised in Philadelphia and coming to the South, I had some of those same reservations. But I, after living in the South for almost 10 years now, can say that I actually found more biases in the North. And so I think that, that's why it's important to use intentionality and to force ourselves to question and to challenge our own biases so that we can form open opinions, or just, give people the opportunity to be who they are. And for me, I think when I think about creating safe spaces, I think about a place that I worked that was with predominantly Black women. And I had never heard so much negative talk about Black women to a Black woman. And the first time that I heard the conversation, I immediately said, I understand why these women would go into the staircases and have conversations and walk around and never have conversations or would talk to each other, because the environment was so hostile that they didn't feel safe. And so I actually created what I call collaboration rooms, where these rooms were designed for people to have conversations and they could sign up and talk. And I specifically created opportunities for them to collaborate with each other and cross teams, because the environment was so, I mean, it was just so toxic that people who on different teams wouldn't talk to each other, and then they wouldn't even talk to each other in the hallway. And it was like, you would think that, you know, I as a Black woman, we like to talk, right? If we around our friends, we like to talk, and nobody's talking, it's very odd. So I saw the sense of the need for that group. And but I also, it required me to first tackle head on the situation. And I had to stop the negative talk and say, I'm not sure who allowed you to engage in these conversations prior to my arrival, but they don't sit well with me. And I'm going to ask that you refrain from talking disparagingly about Black women, because I, for one, am one. Right. And so I don't do that. You're one of the good ones, or you're different. No, I'm not. From the surface, I am the same. And so it's important that you give me the same respect that I expect you to give them. And so that's my example. And I hope that helped answer the question, but also resonates with how sometimes it may seem exactly the opposite, where, you know, you wouldn't think you need to create a safe space because it seems so homogeneous where everybody's the same, but really there is a need because of the environment and the culture that's around.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that perspective.
To know if you all feel more knowledgeable about the pronouns and how to support an inclusive environment, while Lamar can go ahead and answer the question while we're doing the polls. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Brigidann. Sorry about that. I muted myself. I like what Sam said about, like, I don't want to just keep saying things like I have all of the answers, because I've definitely put my foot in my mouth more times than I can count, just saying the wrong thing. But you know, it all comes from a place of me still wanting to know where I can do the right thing, or lead some of these conversations, or walk into spaces and learn. And I think sometimes the challenge, especially for me as somebody who advocates for DEI, the biggest challenge is bringing people into these spaces, because usually the folks who really need to hear this, they aren't here, right? The same way with your effort reporting training at your university. But yeah, I still want to learn. And what I would say to you, if you don't have safe spaces, or you're trying to create safe spaces, or you're trying to learn more about how to appropriately use pronouns, just do it. Just try, you know, give it a shot. One of our first presenters this year in our first webinar, Dr. Dawn Collier, who's our executive director of diversity and culture here at Rutgers, she said, do you want to be right, or do you want to be in community? And often we're too focused on doing the wrong thing or saying the wrong thing that we take ourselves out of community. If you mess up, apologize, work on not doing it again. But there's a place for all of us to continue learning and to continue growing, so that we can participate and create inclusive environments. So I'll just stop with that.
Thank you.
I was going to add, I think what hopefully participants have seen today is we ourselves are learning as well. And one of the things, and I really love the small changes can make a big difference statement, because I think that is so true. But for me, if I'm going to put myself in a place where I'm going to open myself to learnings and I'm going to actively seek that out as a leader in my organization, the big miss is if I go and do that and I don't share what I've learned with others. And so like spaces like this and participating here, I can share my personal stories with a broader audience about, you know, my own vulnerability in where I'm at in my learning journey, about different identities and the language around that. If I don't do that with my team is not going to engage in that work. They're not going to understand that learning is, you know, it's lifelong. And they're also not going to understand how it connects to our day-to-day work with our students, the staff that we support, and the faculty that we are supporting from a research perspective. So that my small change is in any circumstance where I have learned something around these types of issues, that I'm bringing that back. I'm creating conversations with my leadership team so that in turn, hopefully there's a cascade of information that flows through to our line staff, so that they can shore up that knowledge and hopefully sort of catch the bug and really jump into what I would argue is one of the most interesting and vibrant fields of study and experience, because it's not just hypothetical. These are folks' experiences. And when you open yourself up to learning about those different experiences, you grow as a person as well. I mean, there's no downside to exposing yourself to that. So I would say that's the small change I try to bring in my own line of work.
Thank you. And so I guess as a final thought in terms of this, I just want to say, like what Sam had mentioned, like that it's that fear. So if you can get over that fear of asking questions, or fear of saying something wrong, fear of did I offend anybody, the best thing is to ask. Just ask people questions and get familiar with them, and we're all learning. So let's learn together. So I think that's a key takeaway from me, even when I watch Mieko's presentation, is small changes and let's learn together.
I agree, Meena. Just small things that you can do in your everyday situation in life. So it's not always can be a top-down situation, as we know, but what are we doing to embrace it on all of our activities within our language, within our environments, within our collaborations with each other? I want to thank the participants for the final poll, because we had a large number, mostly a yes, you have learned more information about how to be more inclusive in usage of pronouns. So really appreciate your attendance. I know it takes some time to participate, to show up, to be here, to question. And I just want to thank everyone. Also, if it helps anyone with using people's pronouns, this is a comment from the participants. If it helps anyone with using people's pronouns, speaking as a trans person, if you get it wrong, don't fall all over yourself saying you didn't mean to, etc. That can make trans persons' responsibility to make you feel better. Just say sorry, correct yourself with the right pronoun, and keep going. So again, failure is not always a bad thing. Asking questions is always a good thing, as long as we leave with openness and love and willingness to not assume the responses. Make sure you're also open to receive the responses that are to be given and not what you think, because we're here for continued learning. With that said, are there any last comments that any of the panelists would like to share with our membership? And Sam? You look like you want to say something.
Oh no, I was just thinking about, because I struggled for a long time because I used guys all the time, and I just like tried to figure out that. And so a number of years ago, I switched to friends, and so I don't say guys or girls. I always say friends, because people generally don't mind being called. So like even in the grocery store, when I meet somebody, I'm like, well, thank you, friend, and that way I never have to worry about their pronouns. They're better about putting them on name tags now, and I will always do my best to honor someone's pronouns, especially if they go to the trouble of putting them on their name tag, because then I figure that there's a reason that they do it. But it made me think about it when it was brought up, because it's a challenge. My brain struggles with the they them only because of the plural, and it's just it's those stupid years of learning, hard coding something in that doesn't make any sense if you really think about it. And I love the idea of they them. I think if I had been 30 years younger, I probably would have grasped onto they them to acknowledge my more androgynous self. But it's still, I love that. So I like that closing comment of like just looking for what words that you can use that are opening and welcoming. And that's, I chose friends to get rid of guys and gals, although I still talk to the dogs and call them the girls, and I still call my daughters the girls, even though they're women now. So I will fail at that even this afternoon.
And to your point, it's never too late to learn, right? Because a lot of people struggle with the usage of new terminologies just because we're so used to something being done for so long. So unlearning and willing to relearn how to communicate with different generational divides. So part of the reason INCUR puts on these informational sessions and how our expertise panelists can share their personal experiences within the institution. And thank